and they all ask one main question, which is, why is Angela Davis communist? This is a very hard question to answer, mainly because I don't feel I've been taught the true meaning of communism. This is one of my reasons for writing you at the time.
Hold it right there. Why is Angela Davis a communist?
Actually, I think I answered that before when we were talking about what a revolutionary is.
Many times the term communist, because I think it's been used by so many different aspects of our society to put down rather than to let people try to understand. Everybody shuns away from it. It's like it's a disease or something like that. And I just, what I'm trying to get through is that the brother here in that letter is raising a question, and therefore in his question, it seems that he's trying to say that there are some people who are plagued by that, and they let that get in the way. They don't want to know Angela Davis as a person, or even if they do, that prevents them from coming to know Angela Davis.
Well, you see, now that might be true for, say, the vast majority of white people.
Yeah.
But one of the things which really impressed me when I was on the streets and fighting for my job at UCLA was that whenever I spoke to black people, whenever I spoke in the black community, very few people had hang-ups about communism. I can remember many times walking down the street and having someone stop me and say, are you Angela Davis? And I would say yes, and they would express their solidarity and say, a lot of sisters and brothers would say, even though I don't really know what communism is all about, just as the brother here said, we know that there must be something good about it, because otherwise the man wouldn't be coming down on you so hard. So I think that the resistance to understanding what communism is all about doesn't exist nearly as much in the black community as it does in the country as a whole. This letter here is an indication of that. What he's saying is that although he realizes that this country has kept away from him and many of our sisters and brothers the knowledge of what communism is, he wants to know about it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that's, when he says that that's one of the main questions that's asked, I doubt whether there's in the black community, at least, whether there are huge contours of hostility.
Yeah,
it's just a desire, curiosity to know.
And
that's something what I generally say, and I answered the brother and tried to explain in a few words why I was a communist, and I said essentially the same thing that I had said when I told you why I was a revolutionary, because I have a very strong love for oppressed people, for my people. I want to see them free, and I want to see all oppressed people throughout the world free. And I realize that the only way that we can do this is by moving towards a revolutionary society where the needs and the interests and the wishes of all people can be respected.
Angela.
Welcome to another episode of I Am the Revolution. I'm your host for this episode. I am Jay, and today's episode is the Communist Manifesto. We're going to get through part one of this Communist Manifesto. And I thought it was fitting to start with a Black Panther talking about communism. Or I looked up Karl Marx, but I couldn't find any footage of anyone from the Black Panther Party talking specifically about Karl Marx or communism. But I found this video where she's answering a question about somebody saying, basically coming to the understanding that communism in the term and the concept has been intentionally and continuously capitalist, and capitalism has been in a perpetual state of demonizing and confusing what the meaning of communism is. And the long-term strategy of capitalists has been to tie communism to dictatorships, just the understanding of it, and a lot of different things. But anyway, love starting with AD in the beginning, Angela Davis. I'll get to a couple of your comments in just a bit before we get into the reading. So I do have a so let me kind of tell you how this is going to go. Maybe I should do it that way. So we're going to be reading or following, I should say, a audio book, but it's a visual audio book. So we're actually seeing the words, and it's not a lot of these out, because usually these audio books, they just have a picture, like you can see the one behind my screen. This is behind me. This is an audio book that's playing, but it just has the stationary photo. Can you see that? Let me move it so you can see it. So there you go. Just has a stationary photo. And I wanted something where I can see the words on the screen as we're reading. So I found something with that, and we'll pause and discuss in different parts. And that's the reason why I didn't label this as an audio book. It's not just simply we're going to pause and stop. Another reason is I didn't label the audiobook simply of the Communist Manifesto, is because there is a little bit of an introduction we need to do before we read it, and I found a decent video that's about 12 or 13 minutes long that kind of just gives you a little bit of terminology or concepts, give you a very crash course sort of understanding of just some concepts before we start to read. And have a discussion and answer questions and all of that. Now, this is not a teaching. I want this to be from the perspective of somebody who has never read the Communist Manifesto or has a very superficial understanding of what communism is. So that's the perspective of this. That's really what we want, all the perspective, a lot of our I Am the Revolution series, because it's about educating the proletariat's consciousness. So yeah. All right. So just saying hey to everybody. I see several people in the chat that we all know. Thank you, comrades. Thank you, revolutionists. I think the people who come to these streams, or this specific stream, I think we can call revolutionists. Because if you're here to listen to or hear a discussion about communism and the book, The Communist Manifesto, you got to be pretty based. So let's get into the introductory part of this, and I'll bring it up in the same screen here. So we started out with Angela Davis, just kind of talking about why she is a communist. I almost started with a different video of Angela Davis talking, but this was a lot clearer. The other one, the graphics are very poor, but you can hear her fine, but the graphics were very poor. So we'll be starting with this one. Now, the title of this is called The Communist Manifesto Summary. And it just goes over a couple of things to kind of give you a better backdrop to the Communist Manifesto as a whole. And I thought it was a good way for us to get started. Now, before we do that, of course, we have to get everybody on our Substack. And don't forget, Nick is flying out today. He may actually be on the plane right now. Oh, no, he just retweeted something. He retweeted the link for this. So he's flying out to do the main launch, or let me rephrase. Let me say it again. Shama Sawad, Socialist Alternative, and Worker Strike Back is flying RBN Nick out to Seattle to speak and give a speech at the launch, which is tomorrow for Worker Strike Back. So Nick will be out doing that. So shout out to Nick and to doing that, to getting that done and getting his speech done. So hopefully I'm going to try to coordinate with him to set up a stream for his speech. So this is a great reason to get on the Substack. So get on our Substack. This is where you get notifications sent to your email. You get the link, and you can just click on the link and watch the video. But when we go live, because a lot of people like to watch us live and comment and interact live. So we also send out our clips through this Substack. So that's another reason to join our Substack. And then an added bonus is you get access to our Discord. We have a website, revolutionaryblackoutnetwork.com. It is probably 75% done. Still adding and changing some things. Email contact information, info@revblacknetwork.com. We also have memberships for those that are brand new or those that may not have heard, haven't been in a stream in a while. It hasn't been a week long yet since we've had memberships for a week. I'm sorry, for at least 7 days. I think 7 days will be on Monday. So we just got it. We're maybe on the 5th day or something like that. But if you wanted the membership, we have one level right now. We may add others later once we talk and discuss. But $3.99 is the level. You can also do that on Patreon, or if you want to do instead of paying YouTube, you don't want to pay them money, you can give it to Patreon, $4 or even $2. I think is the cheapest you could do on Patreon. And last but not least, let's like this video. Let's see if we can get some more revolutionaries. Let them know that, hey, we're going over the Communist Manifesto today. So we're at 112 people watching. Let's get to 100 likes. Let's just start out immediately from there. Get to 100 likes. And all right, let's see. Comments are starting to pile up. So let me look through. Social democracy, I'm down with that. Communism is a state of things. Forky. Marxist-Leninism is a science. That is true. Or I would agree with the characterization. That is a better way of saying that is true, because it's just a characterization. Violence doesn't solve anything. We can strike en masse, and it would be much more effective and less destructive. Avoiding civil war would be a bonus. Just remember, revolutionaries of the world, unite. Capitalism and socialism and communism are only about money. Social control happens under both. We can fight that. How have humans proved themselves to be humane? So a lot of very philosophical questions and discussion going on in the chat. So it looks like we have a good array of people in the chat for this discussion. Let's get into the introduction sort of part of the Communist Manifesto, and let's listen to this first part here and discuss where needed.
A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. If we're going to summarize the Communist Manifesto, it's important we briefly cover the context in which the Communist Manifesto was written. In 1847, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the piece, socialism and communism were not clearly defined concepts. Everyone had their own eclectic ideas about what these terms meant, all trying to address the problems which had been produced by a fully blooming capitalist society, problems we're still dealing with today. The only thing that was commonly understood by these terms was something beyond the present state of things. And for people in high society at the time whose wealth and property owed its existence to the present state of things, socialism and communism were vague and threatening concepts. Especially communism, which had developed a strong association with the working class emerging at the time who owned nothing and had no...
So with this video, we have to understand communism and the concepts has literally been under attack. You're talking about, this is 1847. I think it's I think that was the time frame. So we're literally, what is that, 80 some odd years? So they have perfected the attack and have convinced the world, or I wouldn't even say the world, have convinced people on the imperialist core, the vast majority, are either confused or have a completely misunderstanding of what communist is, or what communism is, and that is that is needed for the propping up of capital and capitalism, and for people to believe in the system. I'm kind of getting in my head with stuff, and this is why a petty bourgeoisie class is needed. Because if you only had the very the very poor and working class, very poor working class, and no petty bourgeoisie, you would have a lot more people uh, wanting to overthrow the system. But I'm getting in my head of myself. Let's listen to the rest of this sort of summary of the Communist Manifesto first.
No strong ties to the current order. Now, what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels set out to do in the Communist Manifesto was to properly define what that something beyond the present state of things meant. And they do something very interesting. As opposed to laying out grand principles of eternal truth and universal morality upon which the future society shall be constructed, Marx and Engels point out that to accurately understand what can come next, you need to understand how and why human societies change and understand the material conditions that exist right now. And although both Marx and Engels use the terms socialism and communism interchangeably to refer to a society beyond capitalism, they adopt.
So that is key to understanding when you're reading a lot of this historical material, like especially if you're brand new at this and you're reading a lot of this historical material from Engels and Marx. The use of socialism and communism is interchangeable. I think it's Lenin where it really begins, where he starts to make a distinction of socialism and communism, and socialism sort of being the middle stage to getting to communism. So, and you may hear lower communism versus higher communism. That's another reference you may hear or read when studying this work.
Adopt the label communism specifically because of its unique association with the working class, who, as we'll come to see, are absolutely key to understanding and achieving a post-capitalist society. The working class is key to understanding what communism is and how to achieve it. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. This is their theory of how human societies change, known as historical materialism. The history of human societies is propelled by the conflict of material interests between the classes. And this whole first section is dedicated to tracing history using a historical materialist approach.
So I'm going to rewind it, because this concept of materialism that they're explaining very briefly is important to understand. So let me rewind it to this part again here. Here we go.
Hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. This is their theory of how human societies change, known as historical materialism. The history of human societies is propelled by the conflict of material interests between the classes.
The histories of
classes. And this whole first section is...
Hang on a second. Let's do that again.
History of human societies is propelled by the conflict of material interests between the classes. And the
history is propelled by the conflict of material interests. So the conflict of material interests and the results of those fights is what propels history.
And this whole first section is dedicated to tracing history using a historical materialist approach. So we have to understand historical materialism if this section is going to make any sense. Historical materialism starts from the fact that for societies to exist, they need to be able to produce things. The necessities of life, like food and shelter. Without production, there is no society. The things we use to produce things, which would include things like tools, land, minerals, machinery, are known as the means of production. How people relate to the means of production gives us their class position, and with that, their objective material interests. A farmer, whose relation to the land and tools is ownership, is going to have an objective material interest in good weather, good crop yields, minimal wear on tools, etc. Now let's say there's a lord who actually owns the land and tools, and in exchange for allowing the farmers to farm safely on his land, the lord takes a portion of the crop yields. It is in the material interest of the lord to take as much of the yield as possible, while the material interest of the farmers is to keep as much of the yield as possible. Here we have an irreconcilable conflict of material interests between the classes. Our cultures, laws, moralities, ideologies, religions, wars, coups, revolutions, and so on are all products, in the final analysis, of our society's classes and their struggles to advance their material interests. Struggles between different classes, and struggles between different factions of the same class who hold particular material interests that can come into conflict with one another. The conflict of material interests between the lord and farmers, oppressor and oppressed, has no resolution under the current order. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So the oppressing class struggles to hold together this relationship of exploitation for as long as possible. But the struggle can only end in one of two ways. Either the oppressed succeeds in overthrowing the oppressors and establishing a new order that advances and enshrines their material interests, or both competing classes are brought to ruin somehow.
So I think you're like right now we're at a point in our history where the contradictions of class struggle is so glaringly obvious. I'm talking about where you have millions, or let me say hundreds of thousands, if it's not millions, of homeless people, but then you have one person like Bezos with $100 billion plus. So that is a contradiction that has not been able to be resolved because it can't be resolved, but it is just being grotesque. It's getting to the point to where it's grotesque, or it has arrived at the point where it's grotesque. And so now, like what this is saying here, I think we are approaching a point where, as a world, we have to reconstitute itself, and I think this is where the Great Reset plays in. Not the conspiracy, but the actual Great Reset, because they know what's happening. They've studied history. They know how this works. For the vast majority of humans on the planet, the capitalist structure is not working out for the vast majority. So let's get back. I'm going on tangents. My apologies, but let's finish up this video and we'll get to the reading of the Communist Manifesto.
Marx and Engels then turned to the transition from feudalism to capitalism using a historical materialist approach. In feudal society, as with previous societies, we have a complicated arrangement of many different classes, but it's from a small class of town dwellers that the modern capitalist class develops from, also known as the bourgeoisie. These town dwellers made their living from commerce and trade, using their modestly accrued wealth to generate more. They had a keen material interest in developing navigational knowledge, the study of commerce, shipbuilding, bookkeeping, and so on. The discovery of America and foreign conquest opened up new lucrative goods to these town dwellers, spurring an even more intense interest in developing the means of exchange, navigation, communication, and transportation. In the search to yield more wealth from amassed fortunes, these merchants begin to take over industry itself, investing in socialized workshops and the development of the instruments of production, outcompeting traditional individual artisans due to the superior efficiency of socialized production. As the instruments of production developed with the development of the bourgeoisie, they began to come into conflict with the existing relations of production in feudal society, basically property laws, and into conflict with the aristocracy, who had a material interest in maintaining these feudal relations of production. For example, a convoluted and arbitrary feudal judicial system, although great for local lords who enjoyed special privileges and control over local laws, hamstrung trade for the bourgeoisie, and a myriad of internal tariff borders, although great for local lords, inflated prices for the bourgeoisie. Not only this, but much of the population were still peasants. And if the bourgeoisie wanted to continue producing cheaper and cheaper commodities, the supply of labor had to be increased, which meant the traditional peasant-lord relationship had to be disrupted. Here we have the productive power of society's forces of production that have been developed to a point where they are now held back and cramped by the relations of production. We have a reactionary class whose interest is to maintain the current order for as long as possible, despite it holding back production, and we have a revolutionary class who has a material interest in fully utilizing the forces of production, a material interest in abolishing the current order and carrying out a revolutionary reconstitution of society. The English Revolution, and most famously the French Revolution, were such reconstitutions of society by the bourgeoisie, seizing political power from the aristocracy to abolish feudal relations and to enshrine capitalist relations of production. What are the capitalist relations of production anyways? Capitalists are those who privately own and control the means of production. They hire others to work on these means to produce products for a market to make a profit. Workers, also known as the proletariat, do not own the means of production. They work for a wage to live. Workers generate the value, and the capitalist seeks to take as much of the value as possible, paying the worker as little as possible. The worker seeks to keep as much of the value they generate in seeking higher wages. These are two diametrically opposed material interests in which there is no resolution under capitalism. Now, the capitalists, as we've seen, have played an incredibly revolutionary role in history. They've socialized production, tying all corners of the world together in a global web of industry and consumption, and they've revolutionized the instruments of production, creating tools and machinery capable of producing far beyond the necessary requirement to sustain society, with extreme efficiency through relatively simple operations. But just as the forces of production were hampered by the feudal relations of production once before, now too the productive forces in capitalist society have developed to a point where they are constricted by the capitalist relations of production. The productive power of society is now being held back by the capitalist order, and I'll show you what I mean by this. Under capitalism, production is carried out for private profit. As products are produced more and more efficiently, their cost falls and can be sold cheaper to steal buyers from other competing capitalists. Unfortunately, as competing capitalists catch up and manage to sell their products at this cheaper price, the profit rate has fallen, and there is a scramble to lower costs again. Innovation now becomes the enemy of the capitalist in the long run. To fight back against this tendency of the rate of profit to fall, capitalists can monopolize markets, artificially restricting supply and hiking prices well above their cost, completely putting to waste the productivity of society. They can also monopolize intellectual rights, holding back the general adoption of innovative technology. But none of this really matters when the vast majority of workers don't have the money to buy the products. Every capitalist seeks to lower labor costs as much as possible, but still wants buyers. Debt and the hyper-exploitation of the global south can help bridge this contradiction, but it's not particularly stable. As productive industries become less and less of an attractive investment due to their slim return rates, capitalists increasingly swarm to invest in unproductive financial markets and speculative bubbles. Resources wasted in these financial schemes and bubbles are resources that could have been invested to further technological development. When these speculative bubbles periodically pop and capitalists no longer see profit to be made, capitalist society falls into economic crisis. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. The most vulgar expression of the capitalist relations of production, holding back and conflicting with the forces of production. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons. All previous classes outcompeted by capitalists, and those classes deprived of their means of subsistence have sunk into the ranks of the working class. This continuously growing propertyless class now constitutes the overwhelming majority of capitalist society. Having used a historical materialist analysis, we can now understand what communism is. It is in the working class's material interest to abolish private ownership over the means of production, putting an end to the private appropriation of their generated value, and to establish common ownership of these productive instruments and resources, such that the surplus value generated by the workers is owned and controlled by the workers. Everyone's relation to the means of production will be equal, and thus everyone's material interests will be the same. A classless society is possible. This will require the political overthrow of the capitalist class and the establishment of a worker state, in which the instruments of production and society's resources are put under the democratic control of the working people and capitalist.
So, for a real world example, just imagine if the railroad industry was nationalized. Like the profits that all these rail companies and these rail barons get, because the railroad industry is the most profitable industry when you're talking about cost effectiveness and labor and all. I think it's the most, or if it's not the top, it's the second. So imagine it being worker owned and the surplus profits going to those workers. So everybody who works in the industry, first, it wouldn't be, and all these safety issues, all of these things wouldn't exist. Or they would, I would say, I'm not going to say it's extinguished, but they would exist far less in society, I would say, because I don't want to give an absolute. But owning the rail industry is an example, is a perfect example. If we own the means of production, if we own the rail and own the actual rail companies, just think about, why does a private company get to own the actual infrastructure that provides all of us goods and services? I'm sorry, goods. Like, how is a private person owning that? And the same thing. I mean, even we're against the military-industrial complex, abolish it, but like weapons manufacturers, how is that not nationalized? That's so weird. That capitalists has privatized or trying to privatize everything. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent, as I always do when we talk in theory. So I'm trying to stay on point. Let's finish out this video.
Resistance is put down. Following the democratization of the economy, the full productive power of society will be utilized and put towards raising the standard of living for all. Workers can be paid proportionately to the labor they contribute. The more one works, the more one's paid. A necessary portion of the total surplus value generated will be dedicated towards administrative costs, social programs, repair, and most importantly, towards research and development, fostering the further advancement of the forces of production. As the working classes one by one settle matters with their national bourgeoisie, the working classes may unite internationally, unifying the productive power of the entire globe. At a certain point of development, when the forces of production have become so efficient and so ubiquitous, human society may enter a higher phase of communism, in which everyone does the work they can and takes what they need, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. A decrepit and feeble state, long with no antagonistic class to suppress, and no longer having to enforce to each according to their contribution, can complete its total withering away. But this higher phase of communism is not possible.
Let me rewind that last about 20 seconds here to hear this again.
And so ubiquitous, human society may enter a higher phase of communism, in which everyone does the work they can and takes what they need, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. A decrepit and feeble state, long with no antagonistic class to suppress, and no longer having to enforce to each according to their contribution, can complete its total withering away. But this higher phase of communism is not possible without that initial period of development, the lower phase of communism. Now, the rest of the manifesto is a bit more historically specific.
So this is what I was referring to, the lower phase and the higher phase of communism, which later becomes communism and socialism, or the lower phase is called socialism later. And I think Marx is the one, somebody commented also to a lot of times these historical things run together for me because I'm read these a little bit ago. So this is a good refresher for me also. But I do want to hear about the lower phase of communism and all this stuff one more time. So let's replay this last part right here. Forces of production.
The full productive power of society will be utilized and put towards raising the standard of living for all. Workers can be paid proportionately to the labor they contribute. The more one works, the more one's paid. A necessary portion of the total surplus value generated will be dedicated towards administrative costs, social programs, repair, and most importantly, towards research and development, fostering the further advancement of the forces of production. As the working classes one by one settle matters with their national bourgeoisie, the working classes may unite internationally, unifying the productive power of the entire globe. At a certain point of development, when the forces of production have become so efficient and so ubiquitous, human society may enter a higher phase of communism, in which everyone does the work they can and takes what they need from each.
Okay, so we played that part already. All right, so I think I'm going to move to the next part where we're actually going to be reading some of the Communist Manifesto. Let's make sure we hit the like button again. Let's get to 175. We got 175 people watching. So let's get to 175 likes. Let's say 175 revolutionaries watching is a better way to put it. Love the comments, everybody talking to each other. There is a semi troll in the comments. And I love the pushback that people are giving that person and also talking about other stuff. So keep those comments coming. We want to make this more of an interactive experience instead of the typical, we all just sit here and watch. But let's get into the main event, and that is the actual reading of the Communist Manifesto. Now, it is short, but we're not going to do an hour and 30 minutes. We probably break this up into parts, and I'm not going to say how long the parts are. I like to go with feel, so we'll just see how things go when we feel like, okay, let's end here. That's what we will do. But let's listen. And like I said, I will be stopping to discuss certain points. So let's get started.
Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not held back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. First, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Second, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the spectre of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto, to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Section 1. Bourgeois and Proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history,
I'm going to pause it here and kind of go over that again. You may hear in the background the lawn people cutting the lawn. So if you hear, I'm pretty sealed in my room and I got everything closed up, but I know I can hear it, so you possibly can hear buzzing, but that's the leaf blower outside there. They're doing that. And that's typical on Fridays. You normally don't hear that because I usually start at 3 p.m. Eastern or 3:30 Eastern when they're typically done. So you're only hearing them because I'm here early. But let's go back a little bit here. I think to this slide right here.
the history of all
The history of all hitherto, I would say that wrong, existing societies is the history of class struggle. We kind of saw that in the previous video of summation.
hitherto existing societies is the
Hitherto,
history of class struggles. Freeman and slave,
freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in a constant opposition to one another, carried on and uninterrupted. Now look at this here. Now this is where I don't want to get on that tangent, but look at the dynamic, and this is why I say capitalism can't be sort of reformed, because aren't we just reforming the same system of freeman and slave? You have freeman and slave, that's reformed to this, which is reformed to lord and serf, which is reformed to so and so. You know what I mean? And capitalist and employee employer and so and so. So it's just almost like a reinvention of the same sort of oppressor oppressed, never taking out the oppressor and oppressed part when they're reinventing this.
patrician and plebeian, lord and serf,
So that's how you say it, plebeian.
guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending.
So let's adjust this here. Probably should push it away from me. I don't know what this even does here. You can tell me, is this louder? Is this loud right here? You tell me if right here is loud or too low. And then I'll turn it this way and see what that does. Is this louder? Oh, the other way. You said it's quieter. Okay, so let me turn it back the other way then. Right here. Okay. All right. So now I think I'm understanding what this mic, this thing at the bottom does here. So I think this means I'm quieter, right? All right. So now there we go. All right. So now we can get back to the manifesto.
Ending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society, as a whole, is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and, thereby, to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labour between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labour in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its time, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeois is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development.
Unpause myself first. Good thing I'm starting to remember that. I do want to kind of go over that last part. Let's see.
The discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce.
Let me go back. Yeah.
Industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies.
The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry, the place of industrial middle class by industrial millionaires. The leaders of whole industry armies, the modern bourgeoisie.
The modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its time, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeois is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production.
This is the part I was trying to get to when I rewind. We see therefore how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. And so we see that even the bourgeoisie today, it's over time. It wasn't always this way, and that's what that's what they're pointing out here in the book. That there's been like many different iterations, I guess you can say, of what you may refer to as the bourgeoisie class. So going from I don't want to go off into another tangent, so let me sum this up. Yeah, I think I would go off on a tangent, but this to me isn't very important in telling the story of how did we even get the petty bourgeoisie class. So the PMCs who we have today, that's such a problem.
And of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class.
So the reason that's important is because this is tied with that. It makes this important. So maybe back 100 years ago or whatever time frame you want to give, maybe the power that the bourgeoisie, this is essential, I'm trying to break this down. Maybe the power of the bourgeoisie class maybe the bourgeoisie class wasn't as powerful. I should say maybe the bourgeoisie, not class. Bourgeoisie wasn't as powerful then as they are today. Because it says in each step in the development of the bourgeoisie, which we understand over time, they've kind of developed into what they are because of the advancements of technology and industrialization and all of that stuff. But anyway, each step has been accompanied by given more power to the bourgeoisie. So what each iteration of the bourgeoisie, which each reinvention, rebranding, whatever you want to say, comes in a political advancement, and you can see it's at its height right now, where the working class, the people, the general public literally have no bearing whatsoever over what happens. And it's strictly corporate that decides, donors that decide what legislation was passed, how the legislation is written. They actually write the legislation, which is absurd to me. But yeah, I just wanted to point out how they weren't always this powerful per se. Now, maybe if you're compared it to the scale of the time, maybe you can have a different argument, but you get the point.
An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, here independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, there taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. Afterwards, in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and, in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie has, at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
Now, when I first read Communist Manifesto, this section here is the shit that jumped out to me the most. I was like, what? This sounds like this shit is happening right now. But let me explain. Let me back it up a little bit and explain. Let's go back to here. I think this is where it is.
Of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state.
My bad. I did not go back far enough here.
It's the nobility, and, in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie has, at last.
So here's where we're starting the concept that we're going to be discussing here. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market,
Since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway.
doesn't that sound like what the state of the United States right this very second? Conquered in itself in the modern representative state, meaning the modern representative government, and that's what we have, exclusive political sway. And they're describing the bourgeoisie, or they, that is correct. They're describing the bourgeoisie, the donor class, what we call the ruling class now. Exclusive political sway. Wouldn't you describe that's the situation we have right now? It's not that we have some political sway, the average worker. It's that the donors have literally exclusive. When you have an 80% or something like that, 80, 79, 81, 80% support, and that's conservative, that's all political stripes, 80% support for some sort of universal healthcare or single payer healthcare system, and it hasn't happened immediately. How was that? Because the bourgeoisie has conquered in itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state, meaning the Mitch McConnells, the Kevin McCarthy's, the Chuck Schumers, the Nancy Pelosi's, even the Joe Bidens and the presidents, the executive of the modern state, the elected leaders he's speaking of, is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. They're just here managing what the donor class, what the ruling class wants done. Isn't that what we say all the time? So like I said, this is the section when I first read, I was like, what the fuck? When I first read this section right here, I still have flashbacks when I first read it. But let's continue. I may come back to this though. I like this part.
The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound men to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment.
It's another great section to read. Go back a little more right here.
The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound men to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervour, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and, in place of the numberless and feasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverent awe.
This, oh, I thought I was on mute. This point right here, the bourgeoisie, let's put it in current terms, the ruling class, the donor class, has stripped of its halo, has stripped of any sort of good name, every occupation honored and looked upon with any awe or reverence. They've gotten every occupation to sell out. You see Dr. Fauci? So this quote here is another one. So we're in the section of the Communist Manifesto where it made me want to read more and push forward through this, because I'm not a person that reads 500-page books. Not that this one's not one, but I'm not reading a 500-page book. It would take a lot for me to read that. But this book was one where I got to this part, I was like, wow, this made me a lot more interested in reading the rest. And I rewind it back maybe 20 seconds. Let's continue.
Of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and, in place of the numberless and feasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade.
Yeah.
In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation.
This to me is a description of the United States in one word for exploitation, veiled by religious. We pretend to be very religious as a country, and we don't have a religious bone in existence in our country. And then political illusions or lies or propaganda, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. And you see that in things like the earthquake in Syria without the lifting of sanctions. So, yeah. So you may hear some noise. My wife is in the room. So, yeah. She's not the quietest. That's why I always have to say that. All right, so let's continue. Yeah.
The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into its wage labourers.
Dr. Fauci comes to mind, and we don't even have to talk about lawyers and priests. I mean, you got this part right here is another part that rings so true today. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. Experts are now just, I'm paid to say whatever and use my credentials as an expert to get people to believe what I've been paid to sell. There you go. So what I like to do when I'm reading this, and you've already noticed this, is that when I'm reading this book, I like to stop and then apply it to what's today, because this book it feels like a lot of it is talking about today because is talking about the contradictions of capital, which still exists. So let's continue. I don't want to get in. I see some good comments, and I'm trying to stay on topic here, and I don't want to go on tangent, but these are just the results of saying that capital is God, is the priority, is the number one. You'll do and say anything. The person with a degree will bring shame to that degree in education because of money.
The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation.
And I say this all the time. Capitalism is not just fucking up us economically. Relationships, the divorce rate, you don't think that's connected to capitalism when exactly one of the number one reasons people get divorced is money problems? You now don't have the ability to spend time with your family, so you can't develop relationships that you need to with your family. The court system, you have fatherhood has been literally deduced to a paycheck and a weekend visit. So there's no investment in the relationship. So the bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relationship or relation. Let's continue.
The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigour in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie.
This is another part of it. I'm sorry I had to keep stopping it, but it's so much to break down here. I think this is it.
Establish connections everywhere.
Sorry, a little more. I never want to go too far.
And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products.
The need of a constantly expanding market for its product chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. We call them, or publicly in the public space is known as conflict. Something has happened in Somalia and they got this conflict when really it's capitalists chase going around the globe to extract resources for sale. Capitalism, expanding in different markets. And this is the reason why they hate Castro, for example, in Cuba so much, because he kicked the capitalists out. When Baptistas was in power, he gave capitalists free reign to come in. And then Fidel Castro was like, "Oh, no, you motherfucking capitalists, get the fuck out of here." But yeah, we may call this imperialism now. The need of a constant expanded market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Let's continue.
Chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed, or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed, not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And, as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image.
Just
The
another great
bourgeoisie
point. Another
has
great point.
subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeois keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated production and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent, or but loosely connected provinces, with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation, became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labour? We see then the means of production and of exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class.
Yeah.
A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that, by their periodical return, put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part, not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction.
So the epidemic of overproduction, which is a product of capitalism, because you're not producing for user value, you're producing for exchange value. So you overproduce. You know how much food is thrown out from restaurants? You know how much stuff is thrown out? Because it'll go bad, or whatever reason why we throw it out. So here is the opportunity I'll take to talk about exchange value and user value. So you have user value, that is value. You create and manufacture this coat because there is a specific person that needs a coat, or there's people that needs a coat. There's 20,000 people over in the state of Mississippi that needs a coat, so you manufacture 50,000 coats. User value. A company just manufactures 100,000 coats, even though 100,000 people haven't requested or are not looking to buy coats, but just manufacturing and see if they're going to sell it. If they don't sell it, whatever the case may be. You see how it's overproduction? Because you're not producing for people to use, you're producing to sell. This is another reason why you see this more prevalent in the housing market, where you have homeless people, but you have empty homes, and there's enough empty homes to house every single person unhoused right now. But because those homes are not made for use, they're made for exchange value, they're made to sell, they sit empty. If they were made for use, then there would be people in there, because there are people who need homes. And this is the difference in exchange and user value. So let's continue here.
Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered, and so, soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, enforce destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield these weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e., capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed, a class of labourers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labour increases capital. These labourers, who must sell themselves piecemeal.
I'm going. He's getting to, or he's already arrived at the proletariat part, but I'm gonna rewind just a little bit here to catch a little bit more. Here.
And more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapon.
Let me read that part actually.
And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises?
Oops, let me make sure I'm not muted here. The conditions of bourgeoisie society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises?
On the one hand, enforce destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones.
Conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old one. Can you say
That
imperialism?
But
that is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereas crises are prevented. By paving the way for more extensive crises, more extensive and more destructive crises, and diminishing the means whereas crises are developed. I mean, that sounds like a description of the United States Congress. Paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises. How about Armageddon? How about nukes? How about escalation of war? How about even the pandemic? By diminishing the means whereas crises are prevented.
by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield these weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed, a class of labourers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labour increases.
And here is the distress part. When they say, oh, you can work wherever you want, free society, no, it's not. You're creating distress. And you say, you live as long as you can find work. You can live as long as you can find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increase value, meaning you can only find work if you're increasing the value of a capitalist.
Increases capital. These labourers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market.
All the fluctuations of the market, aren't we seeing a bunch of people being laid off? I think Amazon laid off thousands. Can't remember somebody else. I don't want to misquote. But there's several large companies having major layoffs. Let's continue.
Owing to the extensive use of machinery and division of labour, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and, consequently, all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labour, is equal to the cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labour increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of labourers crowded into the factory are organised like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and, above all,
This is the description of our working condition. So let's go back a little bit and cover this again.
not only are they slaves.
Oops. Didn't go back far enough. Classic. I'll go back far enough. Let's go here.
Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois.
Tripping. 1 second, everybody.
As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants.
Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industry army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. You know, your manager, your supervisor.
Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and, above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself.
Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class, the ruling class, and the bourgeoisie state, the government, the state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine. Your computer at work, whatever device you use at work, and by the overlooker, your manager, your supervisor, and above all by individual bourgeoisie manufacturer itself, by Amazon itself.
The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is.
The more openly this disposition proclaims to gain to gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and more embittering it is. Like you're hating your fucking job.
The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labour, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labour of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labour, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the labourer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash than he is set upon by other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual labourers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labour. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workman of the Middle Ages. At this stage, the labourers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If, anywhere, they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is, moreover yet, for a time, able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But, with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level.
Man, it's
The
just
growing
preaching,
competition
preaching,
among the
preaching.
bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises makes the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating.
The growing competition among the bourgeoisie and the resulting commercial crisis make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. That is just a spot on. And you get this when at least I get this when I read the Communist Manifesto. It's a lot of, wow, this shit is happening right the fuck now. You get a lot of that reading. But I'm going to back up one slide, and I think there's a part of this in the next slide. So let's back up a couple of slides.
The non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But, with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor.
So that's the part, man. I was trying to catch it before it went over. The various interests, let me make sure I'm not on mute. Okay. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized. So, lower class, lower middle class, lower upper class, middle upper class, all of those lines, the various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized. The interests and conditions of life are equalized in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions, meaning advancement, I guess you could say.
Machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises makes the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The unceasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trades unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations.
So, of course, it says trade unions, but what we call unions, they club together in order to keep up rate of wages. There's the negotiations for unions.
In order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that placed the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years.
Railways even mentioned back then.
This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves.
This is a key point right here. I'm not sure we're going to end on this point. No, we're not going to end on this point. This is a key point. This organization of the proletariat into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. So what's preventing the proletariat, the workers, from coming together and forming a political party? What's upsetting that plan is the competition between workers. That's what's upsetting that plan. And from everything from culture war to international competition between workers that is sending, manufacturing overseas. This sort of competition is what's disrupting the organization or the organizing of the proletariat, is what it's saying.
But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10 Hours Bill in England was carried. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle. At first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and, thus, to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own instruments of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of society, assumes such a violent glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat. And, in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists, who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may, here and there, be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. In the conditions of the proletariat, those of old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labour, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are, to him, so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern labourer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labour. Wage labour rests exclusively on competition between the labourers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the labourers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable.
What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Love that section.
The end of section 1 of the Manifesto of the Communist Party.
So we have come to the end of section 1 of the Communist Manifesto. Wow, I didn't think if it didn't feel didn't feel that long, and we are about a third. Let me see, 40. Yeah, we're about a third of the way. So we're probably looking to do maybe 3 parts of this, because we're about third of the way through this. So we're looking to do about 3 parts. I know I repeated that, but 3 parts to this Communist Manifesto. So look for part 2. Not sure when what I was thinking is, anytime Nick doesn't join on Friday, I'm thinking on Fridays, I'm going to make this I Am the Revolution Fridays. It's not anything official yet. And it's not every Friday, because sometimes Nick does join and we do the Nick and CJ show. But I'm thinking, twice to 2 to 3 times a month on Fridays. It'll be I Am the Revolution. Things like Ernesto Che Guevara I want to cover, Fidel Castro I'm going to cover, Muhammad Ali, that one's almost ready to go. Of course, we're going to be cover part 2 of the Communist Manifesto. I want to get to Capital by Karl Marx also. So maybe Fridays we can have as our more educational, and then some of the other days. So RBN is schedule is kind of rounding out. Mondays we got Nick and CJ catching up everything, and then Tuesday you got all of us. And then Wednesday, you have Straight Out of Compton, or sorry, Straight Out of Politics and Nick at Night. So you have Nick and CJ, but just split in separate shows. Then on Thursday, you have the Sabby and JB show. Fridays, you have I Am the Revolution. Saturdays, typically Nick will join, maybe Nick and CJ on Saturday, and then Sundays, or Friday, I'm sorry, I missed Friday. Fridays will be I Am the Revolution and the Sabby Sab show. Missed the Sabby Sab show on Fridays. So I was thinking, like, wait, what day is the Sabby show? Then Saturdays, typically Nick and CJ, or Nick only, or CJ only. And then Sunday is JB. And then we start back over. So make sure you stay in tune or engage with RBN. We want to do more content like this one. Join our Substack so you know when we do content like this and we get the notification to you by email. Join our Substack for that reason, and also to get the link to our Discord if you're looking for that. Again, we have membership $3.99. If you're interested and don't mind paying that to YouTube, great. If you don't want to pay that to YouTube, you can also pay that to Patreon, which is scrolling down at the bottom there. I'm checking to see where our count is now. So this is our count as far as our subscribership. Oops, I thought I updated that. So we're at 541. So this is our exact count right now. I just checked 31,541. Thank you for everybody who has subscribed. I'm going to toss up some comments on the way out. Actually, let me see. Who am I going to end with today? Oh, I'll end with the other video I almost had as the intro. It's another Angela Davis video. That's my daughter watching all of these Bluey videos. So, yeah, she's watching Bluey right now. Where's that other end of Angela Davis video? Did I not? Oh, here it goes right here. That's it. This is it. So, yeah, I'll let this play to... and this is from Afro Marxist. Make sure you follow Afro Marxist. A good follow. They put out a lot of good historical content. So we shall end this episode of the Communist Manifesto with Angela Davis talking about communism and Black liberation. So this is Angela Davis talking about communism and Black liberation. Taking us out. Make sure you like this video. We can't increase the amount. We can't bring in new revolutionaries if they don't see content like this, and they won't see content like this unless you're hitting the like button, unless you're sharing. So hit that like button on your way out. Join membership, and I'll toss up your comments as this video plays. Let's see how long this video is here. 3 minutes. It's a 3.5 minutes for this video. So that's a good amount of time to put your comments up. Let me know what state and city you are in or what country you're in. And I'll toss that up along with some of your comments about the topic, the Communist Manifesto. So here we go. Angela Davis.
The struggle of oppressed people, the black masses. Can you respond to that? I hear this quite often. In fact, one woman sent me a letter indicating that this was one reason why she was resigning from the Chicago Angela Davis Defense Committee. What's your response to that?
Well, I think it was very clear from the very beginning of the case that I was a communist, right, because I feel that this is the only way in which we are going to ultimately liberate ourselves as Black people. I would not be in the Communist Party if I felt that the interests of the party were in any way opposite to the interests of Black liberation. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I don't know anything about the case you just mentioned, but my experiences since the acquittal have pointed to precisely the opposite kind of reaction among black people. I mean, not too long after the trial was over, I spoke in Detroit, and it was a really interesting rally. About 10,000 people were present. A lot of them couldn't get in, and we had not expected that kind of massive turnout. And then also, having been in jail for the last couple of years and having been isolated to a certain degree from what was happening on the outside, I was sort of searching for the kinds of things that to say, that people would react to. And I hadn't necessarily planned to talk about communism or socialism, but as soon as I mentioned one thing about the need to challenge the whole monopoly capitalist system and to talk about socialism, there was an incredibly fantastic response, a roaring applause. And these were black workers who were there in Detroit. There are a lot of black auto workers, and the whole stadium was filled with black auto workers primarily.
What you're saying, I take it then, is that it is simply impossible to separate the activities of the Communist Party from the activities of the Black Liberation Movement. Is that what you're saying?
Well, certainly. I mean, otherwise, if as I said before, if I felt that the interests of the party and black people conflicted in any way, I wouldn't be a member of it, because I'm interested first and foremost in the liberation of my people. And I feel that the policy of the party, as well as the practice, has been the only consistently correct approach to black liberation. See, I don't think that we can talk about black liberation without overturning the system, overturning the root cause for the oppression of black people. The only way we can do that, I feel, is through a socialist revolution. And that's going to involve not only black people, but all oppressed people in this society. Effect of socialism on people of color. You look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has large areas populated primarily by Asians, by people of color. I visited, while I was there, the Central Asian Republic of Uzbekistan. And I was far more impressed by what I saw than I had expected to be. Because there was a situation in Uzbekistan and Central Asia where prior to the socialist revolution in 1917, they were living under the worst kind of feudal oppression and repression imaginable. The women in Uzbekistan, because the traditional religion was the religion of Islam. The women, like in many other Arab countries, other Islamic countries, wore long robes and horsehair veils. They weren't allowed to show their face to any other man except their husband. And if their husband suspected that another man had seen their face, that was reason enough for him to kill her with impunity. I mean, that's the kind of situation which existed there. And now you see women in Uzbekistan participating fully in political, economic, social life, high positions in the party and the government. The chairwoman of the House of Nationalities, which is one of the two bodies of the Supreme Soviet in the Soviet Union, is a Central Asian woman from Uzbekistan. Just a couple of more words about the relationship of socialism to people of color. We were in Cuba, and in Cuba, of course, there are vast numbers of black and brown people. And if you compare the situation before the revolution in 1959, when there was the worst kind of racism promoted, encouraged, perpetrated by U.S. imperialists, to the situation now, there isn't any point of comparison at all.